In this video, I'm going to show you how Matt made over $1 million on one 14-unit deal, not even counting how much he made on the other 6-unit deal he closed on right after. I'm going to walk you through the process, how long it took, the before and after pictures, and the total profit. Not too long ago, Matt was in the same position I'm sure many of you are in right now. He was in a 9-to-5, a job he didn't like, and he wanted out. When he came into the acquisitions bootcamp, that was his main goal, to find a home run deal, a deal good enough to allow him to leave his job and start his own real estate business. I told him that I thought it was a very realistic goal, but even I didn't expect him to be able to do it as quickly as he did. So what was the property he bought? It was a 14-unit deal consisting of 12 3-beds and 2 2-beds, all duplexes. You can see what the property looked like when he bought it. It wasn't pretty. He had a lot of work to do to bring rents to market. And this is the strategy I taught him in the acquisitions bootcamp, by the way. Instead of relying on luck for your returns, you learn how to underwrite and you learn how to force appreciation. It involves real work, but once you learn how to run the numbers correctly, you can be almost positive you're going to make real money on the deal. If you'd like to learn this process and how to make money in real estate so you can leave your job just like Matt did, you can apply for the acquisitions bootcamp in the link in the description. At acquisition, this deal was a mess. This was the rent roll acquisition. As you can see, ton of vacant units here, and the units that were leased were at a very, very low rate. This was the in-place income in acquisition, NOI of just 20 grand, right? So the deal was an absolute total mess. The deal was capitalized. Over here, you can see the capital stack. Purchase price was 2.6 million, roughly 185 a key. And with reserves, renovation costs, and deal costs, roughly 240K a key. That may sound high, and that would be high for most markets, but these were duplexes in a pretty high-end market, which is why the exit cap rate is actually a bit lower as well. So this basis isn't as concerning there. If it was a typical kind of Class C product, that would be very concerning. I'd say anything near 200K a key or so would start being concerning. Something I want to point out with the deal costs here is that these are very low for a transaction of this size. Usually for deal costs, you want to peg around 2% of the purchase price. In this case, it's a lot lower, mainly because the deal was seller financed. So you don't need a lot of the extra reports and third-party reports, an appraisal, lender legal fees. You don't even need environmental. So you can really get away with a lot of not doing as much stuff when you have the deal being seller financed, which this one was. It was financed with 90% LTV seller financing, 5% interest rate, 5-year term. At face value, that can seem like a lot. Obviously, 90% sounds like a lot. But if you look at it from a few different lenses, it's actually not that bad. First is that he had a ton of reserves. This deal, he basically ended up putting 100K in overall, actually a little less than that. But he had money anyway, so he could have funded extra reserves. It wasn't that much of an issue to him. Next thing is this DSCR here stabilized. You can see right now it's at a 2.3x DSCR. So that's actually really, really good. Typically, you'd say you're very, very safe once you hit like a 1.4x DSCR, and banks only require 1.25. So it actually wasn't as bad on the leverage side as many people think. And unlike most high leverage debt, which is typically bridge debt, right? He actually had a fixed rate of 5%, so he didn't have to deal with interest rates moving. And he had a longer term of 5 years instead of the typical 12 to 36 month time frame. So it was actually a lot safer than normal. The other thing I'd point out is the debt in relation to the final actual value of the property here is actually pretty low, right? Roughly 50% here, 52%. So it's not as risky as you think sometimes. And I'd encourage people to look at debt not based on the LTV, because a lot of times the LTV can be high if you actually steal the deal, right? If you had purchased this deal for $4 million, the LTV would be low. If you purchase it for 2.6 million, the LTV is high. So you don't just want to look at LTV, you really want to look at the DSCR, because LTV can be misleading if you're actually just buying a deal well, right? It's always going to have a high LTV relatively. So just something to think about there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the business plan. Really, your goal is getting the property from here, where the revenue was 70 grand and the NOI was 20K, to here, where it is now, where the revenue is 360K and NOI is 270K, right? Ultimately resulting in 8% stabilized yield and over $1 million worth of profit. So basically the business plan involved renovating all the units. And this was no small feat. Obviously they were in pretty rough shape here. The current rent roll was $6,120. It eventually got to $32,000, including utility charges and pet rent. So a huge, huge difference, right? You're 5x in the rent roll. And by the way, this is something stupid you'll hear from a lot of people. They'll say, oh, you can't increase the rents that much. You can increase the rents whatever it needs to be to go to market. So if they're currently vacant and market rent is $2,100, you can increase them $2,100. If they're currently occupied and market rent is $2,100 here, the 1,000 to $2,100, you can increase it $1,100. So Where the rents are now has no bearing on what the market rents are. That's something you need to kind of figure out too. Completely unrelated things. If anyone tells you, oh, you can't increase the rents X%, just stupid, right? The market rent is the market rent. Doesn't matter what the in-place rent is. That does not change what the market rent is. So he had to put a lot of money in here. Basically, the business plan was to put in 45K a unit, renovate all these units, and get them up to where they are now. So not that complicated of a business plan, right? There's not that much involved there, but you do need to be able to execute on the renovations and really increase the revenue of the property. As you can see, the expenses moved a little here. This landscape maintenance, this is handled by a tenant now, so that's why it's cut off. The insurance went up a little bit, roughly $1,000 a unit now. R&M running at $1,000 a unit. Management, he's actually not even paying a management fee right now. So technically his NOI is even higher. I just put that in there because I'm assuming the next buyer is going to account for that. And utilities are pretty low right now across the board. So that's kind of the expense load. It didn't move around that much. This is what he initially sent me just to show you. I know because everyone's going to say the NOI margin is really high here, and it is. That's because the taxes are extremely low and the revenue is really high per unit. That's why you're seeing this kind of 75% NOI margin, because these are actually taxed on a residential basis. As you can see here, the numbers he sent me, which are his actual numbers, he has the NOI margin even higher, roughly at 80% there. So it just goes to show you can be kind of outside of the band that people think you need to be operating in, which is typically that 50 to 60% NOI margin range. If you have a property that's a little bit unique, like this one, that are duplexes, higher end, getting higher rents, and taxed at residential numbers. Ultimately, he hasn't sold the property yet, but if he were to sell it, exit cap rate is roughly 6% right now. I know everyone's going to comment about the interest rates. That's where properties are trading for in this market. They're actually trading even a bit lower. I would say high fives right now, but I bumped it up to 6%. And even if you say it's 6.5% or 7%, he's still making good money on the deal. So I'm almost positive this would trade for a 6, but regardless, he's going to make good money on the deal. Should be over $1 million in profit. Equity multiple $2 million, 2x or so in a pretty short time frame. So that's kind of the basics of the deal. I'll get into the renovations now in kind of more detail because I think that really was the crux of the business plan. What did Matt do that was really smart during this transaction? He actually overinvested into the deal. Most people do the opposite. They underinvest. He realized that he was dealing with duplex units in a higher end town and that a more premium renovation would garner more premium rents. The units may not have looked like much initially, but all they needed was a facelift. Because of this, he put a lot of money into the units, roughly 45K a unit. That's a ton. For reference, if you're doing a light renovation, typically you're putting in 5 to 10K unit. A more involved renovation would be in the 15K to 20K unit range. 45K unit is, I would call it nearly unheard of for this type of product, but it worked. He spent roughly 15K per unit on the fencing and landscaping alone. And some people might consider this a waste of money, but the individual yards end up being a huge hit. It made the property feel more like a single family house to renters than a multifamily property. For those of you who don't know, single family homes typically rent for more than multifamily properties do. And as you can see here, his average rents ended up being very high, over $2,200 a unit, which is just below single family rent in the area. So by spending more, he was able to almost make his product look more like single family product, which really, really increased the rents he was able to charge. This deal was not all fun and games, however. For starters, 8 of the 14 units were vacant at acquisition. That meant that he had to eat negative cash flow. Matt was eating negative cash flow for roughly a year-long period. That's roughly how long it took for him to create the value of this deal. So obviously you need a stomach for that, right? Because you have a period where cash flow is not coming in and you're actually sending cash flow out in the form of reserves. So that was the first thing you had to deal with. The second was that the current tenant base, right? When you look at what these rents were, they're really low. The current tenant base was very, very bad. Actually had some drug dealers in there. He had to move out. The way he put it, he said it was a bit of a baptism by fire, just given how he had to go through that eviction process and deal with how extensive the renovations were, right? Because he really updated everything from the plumbing to the backyards to the interiors of the units. So there was a lot going on with that. And that's really what I teach in the acquisitions bootcamp, right? Obviously it involves real work, but you can make real money on the back end. I'm not one of those people who tell you, hey, look, you can do nothing and you're going to make money. That's not how it works. But if you put in the work, you can make a lot of money in a short period of time. And Matt actually ended up buying another deal right around the corner right after this. And he's probably going to make a fair amount of money on that one too. I would guess around 500K to $1 million. And that one's still kind of pending, so I won't get into it too much. But he's done really well. And as you can see from this email chain, right, he actually, the biggest problem he has now is what to do with the money he's made, right? So he has all this profit locked in the deal. Does he refinance? Does he sell? Or does he just sit there and cash flow, right? Because he's basically cash flowing $13K a month right now on the property. So that's actually something I'm helping him through right now overall as well.